Hi, thank you. Hi. I didn't actually make up this title. I had published an article about this subject and people started sending me suggestions like what you should actually call it. So it's been a collaborative effort. As Monica said, I am a journalist. I write a lot about restaurants and chefs. I'm going to talk today about the relationship of chefs and restaurants to celebrity and to attention in general. I know that this is not exactly the same as what you guys do, but I think that, or I hope at least, that there will be some resonance there for you, things that sound familiar. And then at the very end of the talk, I'm going to try and make it a little more pointed toward the drink side of the hospitality industry. I wanted to start by telling you about a night that happened exactly 10 years and 1 month ago. This was on May 24th in Copenhagen, and it was the first edition of Cook It Raw. Cook It Raw was this event, a gathering that brought together, I think it was 12 relatively well-known, but very talented and very creative chefs. Brought them to Copenhagen with the idea that they would be introduced to the local products there, to some of the food culture there, and then with what they learned, they would cook a dinner together. And I know that at this point, you guys are all sitting there saying, yeah, big deal. Because you're all used to guest chef events, to pop-ups, to traveling around the world to do collaborations. But a decade ago, that was not the case. And everything about this event was new. It was really, really unfamiliar to the chefs who were included, which were, for example, René Redzepi was one of them, Albert Adria, David Chang, Massimo Bottura, Claude Bozy. And these guys had met, and I'm using the word guys very pointedly, it was all men. They had met before, but many of them had met, but they really didn't know each other, and they certainly weren't friends at that point. They had definitely heard of each other, however, and they were all a little bit, believe it or not, a little bit intimidated by each other's presence. And so when we got on the bus this first day, where it was taking us someplace that we didn't know where we were going, it had this kind of nervous energy of like kids going to their first day of summer camp. You could just see the thought wheels in their heads, like, am I going to know anybody? Is anybody going to talk to me? Am I going to embarrass myself? But this is what happened. I love this photo. This is actually the one that I love. This is David Chang, and I had never met him before. No, many of the chefs had never met him before, but his reputation definitely preceded him as just this like angry, trash-talking bully of a guy. And then here you have him at the first Cook It Raw with his little basket and his little scarf and his little flowers, and he looks like, a fucking wood nymph or something. And that was kind of the power of what this event could do. Everything about it seemed very new and unfamiliar. It was so new, even like foraging. We didn't really know about that. And so like when René Redzepi walks into a pond and reaches down and pulls a bulrush out of the water and just starts gnawing on it, there was an audible gasp, like, oh, what is he doing? It was the first time any of us had ever tasted sea buckthorn. It was the first time for some of the chefs. We went to a farm, an asparagus farm, and it was the first time that some of the chefs had ever actually talked to a farmer. All of these things would become trends later on, but they were still new. And the dinner itself was extraordinary. I could walk you through the food, which was amazing, but that's not really what I remember. Actually, I do remember the food. But what really stands out from that night was the feeling in the room. And not just the dining room, but the kitchen as well. That's their staff meal from it. For these chefs, they were all so thrilled to be working next to each other, working with people who shared their dedication to craft, to perfection, who honored tradition but really wanted to push things forward, that they left this dinner feeling inspired to be even more creative. And the whole feeling, it was just palpable, was joy. And when the dinner was over, they came into the dining room and actually danced. So that night feels to me like the start of something. It felt like you had all of these guys who were sort of working in isolation up until that point, each of them trying to develop his own vision of cuisine that hadn't really been accepted yet. In some cases, it was outright rejected. But then they kind of found each other. They found their tribe. And in that discovery, I think they also gained a kind of confidence to go forward, to push things ahead even more. So there was a start. But when I look back on it now, I also think that it was the end of something in some way, because I don't know that I've ever seen any of them as happy again as they were that night. Like I said, many of them were well known at that point, but in the years that followed, they would become outright superstars. David Chang, you can see, he would go out, he would win awards, he would be on magazine covers, he would write books, he would start his own magazine, he would be on TV shows, and not just shows about cooking, he would be like a walk-in part on a feature TV series. He would get sponsorship and have Nike make his own shoes for him, win all kinds of awards, start his own podcast, and just started a new media platform together with a celebrity from a whole different area. Let's see, let's try this again. With Massimo Bottura, same thing. Magazine covers, awards, books, chef's table, fashion spread in Italian Vogue, partnership with Gucci, and of course with Rene Redzepi, all kinds of magazine covers, more books, television shows, fashion show. That last thing, by the way, in the bottom left-hand corner is the letter telling him that he's being knighted by the Queen of Denmark. And yes, even the asparagus farmer became famous from this in the years that followed. That asparagus farmer has 11,000 followers on Instagram right now. So all of these guys became leaders in their field and beyond their field, really. And they had opportunities that they never could have imagined when they were in culinary school. But they also found themselves in that ensuing decade spending less time and less energy devoted to the things that had drawn them into the field in the first place, into working with their team, into developing their craft, creating new recipes, into basically cooking. They spent more time managing their image, or as they would learn to call it, as we've all learned to call it, their brand. Now, this didn't happen overnight. It was a slow evolution that predates 2009. But in the past 10 years, in the past decade, those forces that had been kind of gathering steam for a while really kind of took off. It became almost this sort of perfect storm where they kept feeding each other into something of a frenzy. So I'm going to focus on what I see as three of those forces that would come into play. Let me see if I can get the right. First is celebrity. Of course, there have always been celebrity chefs pretty much since when restaurants began. There would be noted, renowned chefs in the 18th century, 19th century. In the 20th century, Paul Bocuse was on the cover of Time magazine in the 1970s. Marco Pierre White was the first rock star chef. But right in the beginning of the 1990s is when the Food Network launched and put chefs on TV, cooking on TV 24 hours a day, and made a handful of chefs, the Jamies, the Marios, the Gordons, into household names. Cooking then became entertainment, and it didn't stay with just cooking, because once you get an audience used to or really interested in watching chefs on TV, they want to go watch it in person. And so eating out, which had up until that point, with some, some regional variations, had been pretty much something you just did on special occasions. Eating out itself became entertainment, and it changed the way that not just that people dined, but the actual restaurants themselves. This is where you see the birth of an open kitchen, or where chefs, for the first time in the history of the restaurants, come out from behind the swinging doors and go out into their dining rooms to mingle with their guests and that sort of thing. People want to see them now. As their status rises, they come to be seen as having specialized knowledge that's worthy of being shared. So there are conferences organized for chefs to get together and do this. They become sort of cultural figures. They're offered book contracts, and not just cookbooks, but memoirs and insider secrets behind the kitchen doors. There are films made, TV series, competitions, all of that kind of thing. Cuisine, in other words, became an area of public life in which attention itself had become a valuable commodity. And for chefs at that point, the question basically became, how do I get more of it? This institution had part of the answer. The World's 50 Best Restaurant Organization started in 2002. You probably have heard the origin story. Restaurant magazine, trade magazine, based here. There were two editors sitting around late one night, definitely stoned, trying to figure out how they could get more attention for their magazine. And in this pot-infused haze, they're like, oh, hey, let's do a list. And they based it on the idea of a music list, in the same way as you might have 100 best albums of the year or something like that. They thought, oh, let's start this list of best restaurants. Chefs loved it, and they loved it for many reasons, but two main ones. The first is that it was seen as more transparent and more in touch with the sort of actual dining scene, with what was happening on the ground, than other older, more stodgy, more mysterious institutions like the Michelin Guide. Also, they also loved the fact that the voters for these awards were made up in part of their own peers. Chefs were on the jury, and so when you made the list, you knew that you had the approval of your community, of the people that you actually worked with and who you most admired. So this thing that started as a whim actually grows stronger and stronger and becomes more influential. And as it becomes influential, it has a real impact on restaurants. Restaurants that make the list see their bookings increase, sometimes by 100% over. Many restaurants have said, I would never have made it if we didn't get onto the list. And a spot in the top 10 or the number 1 can collapse a whole reservation system. So it has a huge impact in that sense, for good. But the thing about this voting system is that its very strength is also its greatest weakness. And what I mean by that is you have this jury of somewhere, it's ranged over time, but somewhere between 700 and 1,000 plus people who are supposed to vote on the 10 best dining experiences they've had in the previous 18 months. What are the problems with that? Well, one of the problems is that they're human, and they are going to go to restaurants that they hear about. And that means that sometimes the list comes to reflect more what's new or hot or getting a lot of buzz than what is truly great or the best. But maybe a more significant problem is that people learn pretty quickly that the list can be manipulated and even gamed. You can't influence what restaurants somebody marks off on their ballot, but you can get people to come to your restaurant, and you can make sure that they have an extra good time while doing it if you fly them across the world business class and put them up in a 5-star hotel and maybe throw in a spa treatment or two. And that's really what happened. And it happened in part because another industry, the PR industry, also saw an opportunity in chefs and restaurants as they came to have more of a presence. Up until this point, a restaurant might hire a PR company just to like help with its opening or something like that. But now they're on like full-time contracts, and a PR person is going to say, sometimes they'll even market themselves on their ability to get restaurants onto the list. So they might, they're going to set up events. They're going to encourage the chefs that they represent to spend all this time flying around from conferences, going from one event to another. Oh, let me like have one of my clients in Bangkok host a special event where I can invite another of my clients in Italy and have them get together and do this special meal, and that's like worthy of press, and we'll fly voters in, and now we've got 2 of our chefs together, they'll both get on the list. All of this contributes to 50 Best itself becoming bigger and more powerful. It goes from being this ranking to a corporate machine. They have other events in other parts of the world, other lists in other parts of the world, and they even at some point hire their own publicists and their own sort of army of influencers as well. Which brings me to the third component, which is media. I'm not going to really go into I'm really running out of time here, but the conventional media, as we all know, is threatened by the rise of first the internet and then of social media. And where this feeds in, where especially social media feeds in with this whole publicity and attention thing, is that influencers in particular are not operating under the same standards that conventional or old school journalists might be. They don't have necessarily the same standards or training, nor should they, because their goals are different. Their goals are to inspire and to create aspiration. And so these people, they are in general happy to take comps. They're happy to ask for comps. They are happy to establish their own credibility, not by doing deep, thoughtful reporting, but by taking selfies with famous chefs. Or by forming partnerships with restaurants in which they get free meals and plane tickets, and the chef gets a post that goes out to their 300,000 followers. Everybody knows this. All restaurants get asked for it, and plenty of chefs go along with it. And they do it not because they're dumb or weak, but they do it because it makes sense. Statistics show over and over again that if you're talking about the millennial generation, they get they make their decisions on where to eat, where to drink, where to go on holiday, not from reviews or guidebooks. They make it based on what they see on Instagram. So yes, this does fill seats for restaurants. So very quickly, let me see. So you have these like 3 forces that are kind of bearing down on the chef: celebrity, 50 Best, social media, chef there. And then all of these things start expanding even more. So let's see, I'm clicking along. There we go. You get new awards, new conferences, new guides, new events. Yeah, it just keeps going. I can just keep going like this. Oh, sorry. So let's go back. And what this means for the chef is that they will spend less time in the kitchen, more time on the road, more pressure to host their own events, to get voters and influencers. There are more and more organizations that are trying to help chefs, but actually exist to make money off of chefs. There are new awards that promise new forms of attention. There are new armies of journalists and bloggers and influencers to attend to. And it's exhausting. And I think it's also soul-sucking in some ways. I don't think it's a coincidence that we have seen so many great chefs very recently, and many of the ones who were at that Cook It Raw, that first Cook It Raw, decide that they want to be doing something more. Whether it is Magnus Nilsson, who recently announced he was closing Faviken because it just wasn't fun anymore, or whether it's somebody like Rene Redzepi, who is opening a school devoted to chefs' leadership, or Ferran Adrià, who's opening a foundation about creativity, or Dan Barber, who's starting a seed company. I think you see, or Massimo Bottura, who's opening these refettorios that are feeding the hungry. I think one of the things that you see in that is people looking for meaning in their lives that they might have once got from cooking. There's something else that concerns me about this, which is that when you write about this kind of stuff, which is as I do, people will come, after they read your work, they'll come up to you and they'll tell you other things. And I have a long list of things I could go through, but I'm just gonna hit some of the big ones. They tell you about depression. This is a quote from a 3-star Michelin chef. I feel that commercial lists and fucked up popularity contests have spread like a disease within my mind. I feel my focus slipping, and all of a sudden I start worrying about networking and landing at a certain number between 1 and 50 because of reasons defined by other people. They tell you about guests who have 50 best voter printed on their business cards, which they slip on the tray when the bill comes. They tell you about somebody who is a renowned voter for another one of these ranking systems called Opinionated About Dining, who, when she finally got a table at one restaurant that she had wanted for a long time, and the power went out and they were unable to continue service, and they tried to do everything to serve her, and yet were unable to, she refused to leave because this was she was who she was. And they will also tell you, and yeah, as I learned recently, let's see, yeah. They'll also tell you that 50 Best would change its rules because chefs felt it was too painful to slide down the list once they moved out of number 1. And they do all of this, I should say, not all of it, this was not, but much of it they do off the record. And why does anyone tell a journalist anything off the record? It's because they're afraid. So think about that for a second. Think about what it means for an organization that purportedly exists to support and celebrate the hospitality industry, that it is feared by the people it supposedly represents. I hear people refer to 50 Best as heroin, as crack, as Golem's ring, but it's not just 50 Best, it's all of it. It is this whole circus, this whole swamp, this whole quest for attention that is so addictive. What does this mean for all of you in the drinks business, in the drinks industry? I know you have your own 50 Best, I know it's influential. I know that you also have brands to contend with, and brands are using you to promote themselves, and you're using them also to promote yourselves. I know that you yourselves or some of your colleagues hire publicists, that some of you are celebrities, that you travel the world doing events. I know that you relinquish your own intellectual property in competitions, so that by turning over recipes, if you win, and you do this in exchange for exposure or attention. I'm not saying, believe it or not, I'm not saying that we should walk away from all of this. I know that restaurants and bars are first and foremost a business, and they don't work if they aren't financially stable. I know that 50 Best and all of the other awards have done real good, important good for this industry. And I know that we are all human, and humans like approval. We like attention. We deserve approval. I'm not suggesting that any of you go and give it all up and become like cocktail monks up in the mountains with hand-carved shakers or something. But I am suggesting, since the theme of this is understanding, that we try and think a little bit harder about the world of hospitality that we are building. Don't give up on rankings, but think about whether those rankings are valuable if you know they've kind of been paid for. Instead of changing the rules to avoid somebody's hurt ego, maybe it's worth changing the rules in favor of greater transparency and integrity. It might be worth remembering that all of those institutions, the 50 Best, the media, the awards, the influencers, all those things that feel so powerful to you, you are more powerful than they are. They cannot exist without you. They need you. Without you, they have nothing to say, they have nothing to celebrate, they don't have any content, they have nothing to make money off of. It's also worth understanding how this quest for attention works as a system, that it all kind of feeds off of itself, and then it can come at the cost of other things you might care about. Finally, that you are not powerless within it. You have helped make it, we have all helped make it, and we can all remake it into the industry that we want. So I'm gonna go back as my very closing to this last slide. No, I'm not, sorry. It was the slide of Chang again. And just say, in the course of my career, I've interviewed hundreds, if not thousands, of chefs, bartenders, somms, servers, and I always ask why they got into the profession. Not one of them, at least no one who is any good, not one of them ever said, it's because I want to be famous. They got into it for the things that I saw at that one Cook It Raw dinner. They got into it for the craft, for the camaraderie, for the sense of belonging to a tribe, and for the joy of making other people happy. It's worth understanding that too. Thank you.